What's up, everybody? It's your boy Drew with High Fight IQ, and you are now watching the MMA Conspiracy Hour with my boys Todd Adkins and Miguel Iterate. Miguel has been the matchmaker for over 200 shows worldwide and has worked with Hook and Shoot, Euphoria, Bodog, and ADCC. Make sure you subscribe to the Todd Atkins Show on YouTube. You can also find Miguel on his YouTube channel at MMA Collector 74. Don't forget to subscribe to High Fight IQ on all social media platforms, the House Call Sports on YouTube, the Fight Pit on YouTube. Now let's talk some fights, baby. Let's go.
If you're with us this far in the podcast, you probably are a diehard fan, like myself and Todd. And on the 1st of August, we lost referee Troy Waugh. He's known as a referee, but he was an original member of the Tulsa Lions Den with Mikey Burnett. Those guys used to drive to Hook and Shoot together. If you look up, Troy Waugh actually competed in one of the Abu Dhabi tournaments as a team, as the 145-pound representative of the Lions Den. From there, he morphed into a referee. I guess his most famous fight refereed was Kimbo and Seth Petroselli, where Kimbo got knocked out. He did a lot of fights all over the world. Just memories and remembering things. He was an Abu Dhabi judge for a long, long time. And he actually was flown in to referee the Australian trials back in the early days of the trial system in Abu Dhabi. And he got stopped in customs, flew from Florida to Hawaii to Australia, got stopped in customs, spent 24 hours in customs, was released, judged the fights, ref the fights, and had to go back to the airport and fly back. He actually spent 36 hours in Australia, which is just one of those ridiculous stories from the early days of the sport. And, he was a guy that loved to live life. And the only thing, and I know that he left us with very little regrets. I got to see him last year. He led a full life. So it's not to mourn him so much as to celebrate everything that he contributed to the sport. The only really sad part is that he died. He was under 60. So in my book, he was still relatively a young man that had a lot more time possibly to give, but it wasn't meant to be. But I miss him, and I just wanted to bring him up. Some people at this point of the podcast may or may not remember who he was, but look him up. He was a character.
All right, this is Todd Atkins, and I'm back with Miguel Iterate, and we're going to get his thoughts on the judge's decision, Judge Bulwer's decision to decline the first settlement that UFC and the plaintiffs had agreed to. And there will be a status meeting July 12th, so we'll know more about specific reasons as to why he did it.
August 12th?
Yeah. No, it's going to be August, I think, the 18th or 19th. I think it's the
July
19th.
12th was like 3 weeks ago. So
yeah, August 19th. July 12th was the first. Yeah, August 19th, okay. I think is when it is. But that's when he's supposed to release his reasons why. But anyway, Miguel didn't get his chance to react. I did a show with Zach Arnold. Miguel hasn't listened to it, so this is going to be fresh Miguel response to this, and I'm interested to see, contrast and compare. And so, Miguel, I'm going to let you kind of open your statements on this.
Well, I can't say I feel like the judge is actually doing his job. I feel like the judge is a person in a position where some of the UFC's tactics shouldn't work on him, right? So, now there's a innuendo that he knew them in high school, or that. Here's the thing to me about Dana. Dana's a bully, right? And everybody who's come up against him, he runs over, and he runs over because he's got this relentless personality and relentless nature. So what has happened over the years, after he got rid of some people who were trying to compete with him, like, for example, Pride was actively, when Pride invited, people may not remember this, but I always got a huge kick out of it. I thought it was really funny. When Pride and the UFC finally came to an agreement where they were going to exchange fighters, they actually had Chuck Liddell go to Pride and fight. People may not remember it. And it's hilarious to me that when they introduced Chuck Liddell with the big lights and stuff in Pride, they put his name as Chak. They spelled his name wrong on purpose, That type of person that would try to face Dana head on became less and less, and the UFC head on disappeared at some point, and they had their own way. And that's the thing about bullies is, if you've been bullied or you've watched bully behavior, most people will not take them on. Most people will not even, same thing with a liar. A lot of people lie, and many people know they're lying, but to actually call them out on their lie and say, you're a liar in this, most people just sit back and say, he's a liar, I'm not getting into it. And Dana is maybe both of those things, a liar and a bully. And the number of people who have the type of personality that could take him on are very few on the planet, because he is relentless. He hasn't gotten the company to the billion-dollar company he has by not being relentless. But is he right? That's what the judge is for. Now, at some point, most of anybody in the MMA business said, not worth taking him on, you'll get run over. You've got guys like, Jordan Rebney and Bellator. As soon as he was able to get out and sell it to a big company, he got out and sold it to a big company.
Well, they pushed him out though, didn't they?
Well,
Yeah.
it was his creation, and he was starting to show some problems. And again, as decent a promotion as he created, he wasn't ready to take on the UFC and Dana. And neither was Scott Coker, and neither was any of those entities there. So those guys just kind of got by not, taking them on. Scott Coker mildly signed UFC retreads every once in a while to try to make a big splash, but it didn't get the company anywhere. The PFL's got a billionaire owner and stuff like that. But again, the difference between Don Davis and the Fertittas is Don Davis isn't using a cent of his own money. So that fiery passion that Dana and the Fertittas had from the beginning was kill everybody. Everybody dies. And they achieved that. They actually achieved it. So now, again, I ask, is it right? Because now the judge, especially in his position right now, is the only person who actually can ask that question and legitimately dig for an answer. Because a reporter asks for it, you get banned from the sport. Dana doesn't even deal with you, calls you a moron, whatever. A competitor does it. Dana says things like, another billionaire wants to lose all his money, or I'm the only one who knows. I'm the expert of this. These are the kinds of things that still come out of Dana's mouth. Why? Because he's a bully. You still don't get away from that. So who's going to take him on? If the judge does his job properly, and again, some of the tactics of the UFC, like, now there might be, unless they find, something heinous on the judge, I don't want to, dig into deep, like, he boils kittens at home. There are tactics of destroying somebody like that. They really can't go after a judge that way. judge does have a position of power there, and the judge, I believe, in this particular case, should also have the ability to say, look, I've been reviewing this case for 10 years as well. I think that the lawsuit that was initiated here is actually the tip of the iceberg of their behavior, that this is a monopoly, and that this has to be taken down. And, you know, as big as the UFC is, I think I read, and I'm not an expert on this stuff, but, you know, government agencies, when they want to go after somebody, like I think Google just today, you know, or in the last couple of days, was told that they are a monopoly on their search engine and that they're supposed to be broken up or changed or have to change business practices and stuff. That's a lot more money than the UFC. Yeah, the UFC is not as big as Google. I don't think in money or power or influencing the world and stuff. So if you can go after Google at the government agency level, if they see something wrong and they're doing their job correctly, that's the entity, right? We suspected from the very beginning that the lawsuit from the fighters, as good a lawyer as our friend, what's his name?
Oh, Bob Macy.
Yeah, Bob Macy. As good a lawyer as Bob Macy is, he's going to run into a wall with the UFC because of resources, because of them having, like, there was recently something, I think you showed me a link where one of the UFC lawyers had put on his social media how, like, he had successfully managed to navigate this lawsuit and stuff like that. Again, doesn't mean that they're right. So
they had already put it in there as if the lawsuit was going to be accepted, and it wasn't. And so, yeah, he kind of looked like a fool doing that.
And just on our litmus test since the very beginning of this, when the $335 million, before the $335 million was announced, and we were being told that this lawsuit was unlikely to settle because the plaintiffs were looking for business changes and were kind of in solidarity of that. And I was the one who questioned. I said, you know, if they throw enough money at it, they'll break. You could go back to our podcast, and that's exactly what we said. If you throw enough money at it, and then we started the speculation game. How much money should it be? And every one of our speculations started off a lot higher than what the settlement that was accepted, that the UFC offered was. And as soon as the $335 million was announced, our first reaction was, that's low. Of course, Dana and his lawyers and stuff will say, of course that's not low, and whatever justifications, now they get to justify it in court in front of 12 people like me and you, hopefully. They'll think for themselves and realize that if Dana has $500 million and can bet $75,000 a hand in poker just on a whim, that offering guys that went into a cage to make that company money $5,000 for everything that they've done is absolutely a travesty.
Yeah, and you also said, I don't think any amount of money is going to be able to solve this, because like you had said, you felt like maybe it was done, but you did bring up the point that, and I think most people feel this way. I think it's the worst kept secret in MMA. The UFC is guilty of antitrust violations. It's not a secret. The judge knows the law, or he wouldn't be a judge. You know what I mean? He's looked at it. He knows it. So he's not going to let them just throw a little bit of money at it, not change any of their business practices and walk away. He's not. I don't care if they give $8 billion. If they don't change, the whole point of this lawsuit was not necessarily money. It was what the UFC is doing is illegal. And if they can't just say, oh, we're going to pay some money and continue to do what we've been doing, all the same things that got us here, we're going to continue to do. I don't think the judge will go for that. I don't care if it's $1 billion, $2 billion. I don't think he'll go for it.
Yeah, he shouldn't. I think that the job, like I opened this with, I think the judge is actually doing his job.
Yeah.
As opposed to taking the easy way out, he's going to go down the hard way. You know, he's going to there's going to be pressure put on him to perform. Now there's got to be a lot of work done, as we mentioned, things like going through 20 years worth of email. Now in Bob Macy's case, in that part of the lawsuit, we know that because of statute of limitations with the fighters that fought, that there's a whole core of old school fighters that are not even involved in the lawsuit. So now you've cut out maybe, I don't know, the first 5 or 8 years of Zuffa. And those things, Bob Macy was like, that's 2003. I'm not looking at that month of emails. We've talked about it before, the famous Joe Silva email. We now own MMA. That seems to be, something that Bob Macy felt comfortable and that was damaging to the UFC. But that's really the only email I've heard about. And now, again, like I said, you need a federal institution. I don't know if it's the Department of the Treasury or the FBI themselves, but you need them to say, there's now a UFC monopoly department with 200 employees studying this thing and looking back at every email, because you got to trace it back to the beginning, even if maybe they can't be used, like, for example, if anybody before 2010 can't claim any money from any settlement or anything because of statutes and limitations, it doesn't mean that those fighters weren't wronged. And it doesn't mean that that's not where the trail begins of the monopoly type behavior. Again, and there were other aspects to it that are not the fighters. Magazine owners, managers, T-shirt companies. Many people were making money off of the business in a natural, competitive way. For example, Tap Out did very well. There were other clothing companies that didn't do as well, but they tried. That's what competition is about. And the UFC crushed it. Now, Tap Out obviously is still out there, but they're kind of like Orange County Choppers, where it's been franchised and marketed differently. And now, Tap Out's not even just a fight company, but it started out as a fight company. And the UFC had a severe effect on them, because Tap Out would walk in to every UFC card and say, which fighters do we like? Here, wear our shorts and here's some money. And because they had a little bit more money at some point than other companies, they were able to outperform other companies. But that's competition. And what did the UFC do to that? They said, they're making money. I don't want them to make money. I want to make that money. I'm going to rule this out. Now, nobody in the UFC can wear anything that they want. They have to go through the UFC and wear our uniform. And I looked this up from the last time we talked about this. I believe at the championship level, guys made $40,000 during the Reebok era for wearing the Reebok outfit. And a lot of fighters were making more than $40,000 on their sponsors. So many complain. Matt Mitrione is one that I talked to about him personally with that. Just one example of a lot of guys that said, I could go out to my sponsors and count on, hodgepodging together, but getting a good check afterwards. And now it's down to 40 grand. And we know that the Reebok deal was $77 million. And we know at some point, things went wrong. Reebok put out examples of, shirts with names misspelled and stuff. And to a company like Reebok, this deal was a small-time deal. It was a $77 million deal for the whole roster, whereas, one basketball player gets that. So for Reebok, I think that they didn't put their A team on it, and now they're out of it, and they chalk it up to a learning experience, but they won't get involved again. They don't care. It was small money. Venom comes in, and now not as much is known about the Venom deal. How much money did Venom pay the UFC? Because you know what, John Jones and the championship level fighters that made $40,000 on the you know what they get now? They get $42,000. they got a $2,000 raise. I strongly doubt that Venom paid anywhere near the $77 million. I think it would have had to have been. Just look at the progression of sport contracts. TV deals for the NBA are now in the billions of dollars. I remember when they were in the hundreds of millions. Every year, the numbers go up. The minimum salary for fighters, for baseball players, football players, all of them go up, and they go up by big chunks as revenue comes in. Now, the UFC, I see nothing that tells me that their revenue is not coming in on a straight line like that. Maybe even spikier than the NFL and NBA and groups like that have shown constant growth over the years. The UFC is no longer an upstart company. They're not somebody who's, fly by night, been around. They've been a corporation of this level for years, and there's never been a tail off of profits. It's always been spiking up. So I mentioned this in one of the other podcasts, they're masters of obfuscation and communication and getting their message out and running over anybody else that is trying to make them look bad or trying to do something. It's as simple as, Conor McGregor, he's got to fight. We have a $20 million gate, and then they go out and they announce, at this last UFC show, we pulled in 3.2 million, at the gate. We got this many pay-per-view buys, this, that, the other thing. It does not answer how much overall profit they made with all their income streams.
Yeah. One thing that you kind of, I'm sorry, one thing that you kind of touched on, that Zach touched on also, I want to ask you about this because Zach brought it up and you kind of brought it up with your federal, there needs to be federal insight. Zach said he thinks there might be outside counsel that gets brought into this for the fighters. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I think that Bob Mazy has taken it as far as he can as the lead lawyer.
Well, Kramer's the lead lawyer. Bob Mazy is one of them. Eric Kramer is the lead lawyer for the plaintiffs, but Bob Mazy is one of them.
Okay. Then Derek Kramer has taken this as far as he can. Mazy, obviously, a Cornell-educated lawyer, not dumb guys that pursued this with a lot of passion from the beginning and put 10 years into it. But the effect I talked about earlier, where taking on this corporation, now it's something headed by Dana, you will get worn out. Dana is that type of person that he'll wear you out. And I think that they're tired. And I think that they are only looking at a fraction of, they've already limited the lawsuit to look at only a fraction of the UFC's behavior that would actually prove them to be a monopoly. The things I've talked about with the clothing deals, the managers, examine the management companies now. They're signing 1-0, 2-0 fighters in South America, telling them that, hey, if you keep winning it, I will get you in the UFC. Now, if one of those guys said, hey, this guy Miguel's going to manage me, I would not be able to get him in the UFC even with a 10-0 record.
20-0.
They would have to go the path of the existing companies that are out there. Again, another monopoly. And there are all kinds of facts, rumors, and things about the interpersonal relationships of some of the players in there. And it ranges from, monopoly type behavior to actually really sordid and ugly, immoral behavior. And I think some of the insiders out there may know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to mention any more of it there. But the reason people get involved there, again, is just two things: money and that Dana has allowed you. So, like I said, the thing about Dana is there's no doubt, after watching his behavior for many years, that you're talking about a guy who, in a room of 8 personalities, might be the last man standing, no matter who. You're talking about a guy, maybe, I would compare Dana's focus and attitude to like a guy like a Kobe Bryant. Like guys like that Jordan, guys like that compete and want to fight at that level are very few and far between. And that's what you're facing with Dana. But again, you go back to it. It doesn't mean he's right. It just means that nobody will tell him he's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things popping up. I'll kind of mention a couple other things. I know you had talked about, you brought up the evidence. Like I'm saying, I don't think that unless the UFC offers a better settlement with more contractual concessions, there's no way to avoid trial.
I wonder what would happen if they shut down the Vegas operation, opened the company back up under a slightly different corporate name in Riyadh, and just clear bankruptcy on the United States side. How they would continue? They could be facing some type of reaction as far as they do need to broadcast and show the sport in the United States to monetize it properly. If they weren't able to show it in this market, they would suffer a hit in revenue. But could they produce a market, produce a company rather, in a different area of the world where they just don't give a fuck? Sorry about the language, but they just don't care about monopolies and things like that. You're talking about, Riyadh is, one guy makes all the decisions over there, and his money's from oil. You think he's like interested in competing, bringing in other oil companies and other oil managements and things like that to his country? No, it all goes through them. We have the case of ONE FC. All signs point to the fact that ONE FC is not going to be able to come into the United States market anywhere as easily as they could, as we thought or hoped, and will not be able to compete with the UFC under the current circumstances. And they may not be interested in doing that anymore. And the reason for that is because Singapore, where they're based, and Asia, where they operate in countries like Thailand and Malaysia and things like that, Philippines, with big shows and stuff, they are able to have even more restrictive contracts than the UFC does, because the law allows it.
Yeah. One thing that Zach touched on that I want to ask you about is he felt like the judge also has concerns that the fighters don't know what's going on with this settlement.
I think we've touched upon this. You know what I mean? So this breaks down into a 1,000, 1,100, 1,200, between 1,100 and 1,200 fighters in the lawsuit, according to Bob Mazey. Now you're talking about lives. Let's take the case of Spencer Fisher, a guy who fought a lot in the UFC, a guy who, after the Hermes Franca fight, was in an airport where he talked about, trying to walk a straight line in the airport, where it was marked on the floor, and not being able to do it. Yet he fought 7 or 8 more times. Remember, as crazy as Diego Sanchez's manager was, that Fabia guy, he did bring up the fact that the UFC doesn't give a F about any of the possible mental damage or actual medical repercussions of what these guys are suffering. And Diego's had so many knockdown, drag-out fights that he does sometimes come across as a little loopy, a little wacky, a little like, people are concerned at times. Spencer Fisher's a guy that fought at least 7 more times in the UFC after he showed neurological damage and can no longer walk a straight line. I've interviewed him, and we had a great interview. He remembers the fights. Like a lot of people with this type of, maybe brain damage or whatever you want to call it. I don't want to use the wrong terms or put Spencer down, but a lot of people in the fight games, going back into history, I'm a history buff. I Ad Walgas from 1910, the 1910 lightweight boxing champion, is the poster boy for boxers' pugilistic dementia. He was the first athlete mentioned in medical texts from back then, and he spent the last 25 years of his life there. And you could get him to talk lucidly about his fights. But then Spencer Fisher leaves his keys in the fridge. Now, nobody's talking about that type of thing where they actually, the instigation for this lawsuit is that Gerald Streben, and Gerald Streben had a lot of baggage going into that fight. There was a murder in that era and stuff like that, a lot of baggage. He goes into that fight with Josh Thompson and he gets knocked out. Bob Mazie is training with them. He's asking for money for to return home because the pay is unbelievably low. And on top of that, after suffering a pretty brutal knockout, he has to pay for his own MRI. So how do you quantify that level of damage so a guy like even Gerald Streben, who had that knockout there are other guys that may have gotten out with 10 or 12 fights and never been brutally knocked out that way. How do you split the money up? You just give them $5,000 each? Guys that are suffering now from the sport are in this lawsuit a lot more than others. Guys that dedicated a few years to the sport, never broke into the big money, and are now maybe working low-paying jobs and struggling to get by. Compared to other guys, like I've heard the absurdity that Conor McGregor and Ronda Rousey are going to get a piece of the lawsuit. They should be embarrassed to take it. They should give it to Spencer and others of that like who are in that type of boat.
Yeah.
So, of course, if Ronda, because she was in the big fights and that's how they're going to decide the money and this, that, and the other stuff, if Ronda's doing $1 million out of that lawsuit, and then they're offering a mass of guys $5,000, take it or leave it. Yeah, this is something kind of bad there. So let's look at this. Mid guys. Guy's going to get $300,000 from the UFC lawsuit. A guy put in a few years with them, maybe got a title shot, didn't break through and get the title, but was a guy that we all watched on main card pay-per-views for a while. He's due $300,000. What do you do if you're a guy who's due to get $15,000 and you get called by the $300,000 payoff, and he says, "Look, man, we got to settle. I got to get this money. I need it, and it's going to change. $300,000 is enough to change things in some people's lives. $5,000 is not. How many people's lives are really going to change? How was the decision? This is another thing that's not clear to me. How was the decision to accept the settlement in the first place taken? Was it a head count of all the fighters? Because at that moment, why would any fighter on the Johnson end who was due $5,000 ever say, "Yeah, let's take it"? And there's supposedly a lot of those guys, right? So now let's say there's 300 guys who are going to get $5,000 each. Then it becomes a lot easier to get. Here's another one. Is it a 51% consent? Once you get to half the fighters say, "Yeah, let's take the lawsuit," everybody else, we got to take it? Is it 75%? Is it just the lawyers' decisions? How was the decision to get this settlement taken? I think the judge is right. I need an answer to that question. So does he.
I want to ask you something that I asked Zach. Like the consensus of most fans, pundits, people on Twitter was that this settlement sucks. But you really haven't heard many fighters talk about it. Why do you think that is?
Well, if you're involved in a lawsuit, I think that there is a position where even Bob Macy hasn't come out in public and said anything or anything like that. I think that there's still maybe even some type of legal reason why they're not speaking up. You know, there may be a limitation where it's like 60. Remember, Bob Macy had said 60 days before he can actually make a comment and stuff like that. And then, but still, you're getting a trickle of information. And a simple question is like, how was the decision to accept this settlement taken? That's somebody knows. Well, the lawyers decided. Well, we voted it was 51%. We voted it was 80%. We vote, how was it taken? I think that those are all very important. I think that what would be interesting too is to see a list of all 1,174 fighters and what money were they going to get? Because I'll tell you what, I can predict to you who voted yes and who voted no if there was a vote. So I think that a lot of the fighters and their position, their opinions is kind of being brushed away a little bit. Like they're being treated in mass. Like the idea that the Johnson plaintiffs were going to get 5,000. How about why? So if you didn't fight in Brazil, if you fought in Brazil, those shows and those fighters don't get paid in the lawsuit. So if you had to fight in some other country or something, that doesn't count in your UFC career in terms of the settlement of this payout. Why? Because all that money, if they made the money in Brazil, that money came back here. That money goes to Endeavor at this point. There's no Endeavor Brazil, is there? Maybe they have bank accounts there and stuff like that. And that is another reason why a true financial accounting of this stuff, a final number, this UFC, what is the total final profit on it? What's the total profit on the next one, and the next one, and the next one? How are they making money not related to the shows? Add all that in. And that's where, in my speculative world, I think Dana and the Fertittas, at the end of the day, they're casino owners. They're bookies. So now you take this a fight like UFC 300. We've talked about this as well, but to repeat for anybody else who's listening here, you take a UFC like 300, and I think at the end they added the Pereira-Aguirre fight. Is that what happened on that one? Was that? Am I mixing it up? Okay, great. And their main event had fallen apart, and then they went with for a long time a main event of the flyweight women's champions. And it was a match that had a Chinese girl versus another Chinese girl. The biggest casinos and the biggest gambling culture in the world is Asia. The Chinese, the Vietnamese. You have Kung Lee as one of the plaintiffs of this first part of the lawsuit. He was really the first breakthrough Vietnamese athlete of that level. With Nam Phan and a couple of others that may be here and there, you pulled in that culture and that interest. But those people gamble. Does anybody in the UFC receive some type of consulting fee for those houses over there that are not expert on the sport to lay down lines? Do they actually act as middlemen for high-end gamblers? You can't just make a $10 million bet. There's got to be somebody prepared to take it. Action coming in the other way. You got 10 million, I got 8 million. We can bet against each other, maybe head to head, if we disagree. But taking a $10 million bet at one point and then handling it with the $50, $100, and $200 bets coming in on the other end and stuff, That's not the way those gambling houses operate, but I do think that there are high-end gamblers. How are they handled by casino owners and bookers? They just let it happen. They don't know. They're ignorant. They're like, oh, well, we didn't realize it. I find it hard to believe that. And when you talk about guys that can bet 5 million on a fight, 2 million on a fight, 10 million on a fight, one bet where a house handling that bet takes a 10% bite, and some of the UFC fight night shows get $800,000, gates. You're talking about doubling the gate in some shows. You're talking about maybe more if you're talking about actually much bigger fight bets. And we haven't even mentioned the Russians and the Chechens, who are also a gambling culture. So, and when I mentioned that to Bob Macy, he seemed to think that there may not be a touch of that, but we're talking about astronomical money moving there. We're talking about, not everybody bets $500 on the UFC and that's it, everybody's happy. There are high rollers. There are people that will bet more. And every single sign we've seen of the UFC that when they smell money, they go in there and they get involved and they grab their bite. You're going to tell me they let high roller action go? I would like to see some kind of confirmation of that. And again, that would raise the total income. It might be illegal in some of the things that they're doing, actually. But you can take in China, gambling's legal. In Vegas, gambling's legal. Again, but how do they handle the high rollers? Can you gamble on a show that was in a smaller state or in Brazil? I'm not sure there are casinos in Brazil. I don't remember that there were when I was there. I've been there about a half a dozen times. Again, like I said, their tendency has always been when they smell money to go and grab their bite. It's the way casino owners think. We ran shows here in the show, boxing shows and stuff here in Costa Rica for a casino owner, and their minds think this way. How do we grab a bite of the parking, the concessions, the liquor? They want a bite of everything. So when you're talking about high roller betting that does go on at the sport, I don't believe, my opinion is that that's another source of income. That's a high source of income. That's where a lot of the money that goes to the executives winds up, and something that should also be divided up for the fighters.
Yeah, it's almost like we were talking about sponsors. That's gone. I guess clothing will fall in sponsors, but sponsors, clothing, gambling if they want to bet on themselves to win.
You can't pick your own managers anymore.
Right, but I'm talking about income wise.
Company that already works there.
Yeah, and that does affect their income because the UFC managers aren't working for their best interests.
No,
they're going with the UFC or they'll be out. So yeah, they're like you said, there's all kinds of things a judge could look at and see that it's fairly obvious how they're operating, and their behavior hasn't changed. This is something Zach talked about. The judge got a free preview of how their behavior would be after they thought they won the settlement. They didn't change one iota. They were just as arrogant.
We've touched upon a few different points beyond the lawsuit that bear exploration. And now, if you can put that picture together in an investigation, and that picture should come through because of emails and communications that are still, that will now be part of the record. It's the totality of their behavior that actually makes them a monopoly, not just crushing the fight competition and the fight shows. So yeah, this should get interesting if the judge holds ground and actually calls for a greater investigation. As Zach may have said, some outside counsel bought in. Somebody from that can say, all right, we need, go to in front of the judge and say, we need 3 months because we've got 250 accountants and bookkeepers and clerks going through 20 years worth of emails.
Yeah, he was saying he thinks that now that it has gone on this long and there's been a first settlement review, that other lawyers are starting getting fighters' ears and probably telling them, hey, look, you aren't being represented the way you should be. Because that's natural, just like in the fight game when managers talk to fighters. He suspects that other lawyers have started to do that as well.
Yeah, in certain situations, and I know that Mark Hunt doesn't like us too much because, at the end of the day, I have my opinions, and I'm certainly at times not an expert opinion. But Mark is a guy who may very well have a case that would be better for him to take on individually, which he has done. He has sued them separately. How many other fighters might be in that same boat where getting out of this class action lawsuit and taking their case directly at the UFC may have a stronger case? A guy like Spencer Fisher, who said, so Spencer may not have the resources for the lawyers, and I don't think his income matches up to what Mark Hunt made over his career. And Mark's also got, I think it's his wife or a girlfriend or something like that that's also the lawyer. So it's like a personal situation there for them. And he's able to advance a lawsuit there. But, Spencer could even sue the UFC. And in my opinion, he could sue the boxing commissions as well. Because this is what I see happens here. You can go back and look at his UFC career. He says he was never the same after the Hermes Franca fight, that he had trouble walking a straight line, and now he's got situations where sometimes he's driving down the road, he's not sure where he was going. I forgot I was going to Walmart kind of thing. Yet he fought 7 more times. Did nobody think to take another MRI? Because the boxing commission only says, well, we need an MRI every 3 years. But if he was suspended for being knocked out, then he has to have a new one to file. But there are times where it seems like the boxing commission only does that. It's like, does he have his new MRI? What date is it? Is it in the dates? Okay, he's renewed for 3 more years. Does a fucking doctor actually look at like an original MRI and the new MRI and compare and see if there's any damage? Is there any medical work being done, or is it just friggin' paperwork being pushed? So yeah, the problems in this sport, and Spencer, I know in particular, is a family man. His wife, he's got kids. They used to live in Iowa. During his fight career, he moved back to the Carolinas, where he's originally from, and he's not living in the lap of luxury or anything like that. They're getting by. I think that he was looking into stem cells and things like that to see if it helps, but he can't afford stem cells. And I don't mean to pick on him. It's just that because of the interview, I spoke with his wife a little bit too, and we set up the interview, and we wanted to make sure he was comfortable. I've asked him to follow up on it, and for other things, and he did not feel up to it. So his is a situation that I'm more familiar with than others, but there are going to be other guys in that boat. And again, the UFC had him fight. The guy suffered damage in the fight, and they rolled him out 7 more times. And I present to you that his fights after Hermes Franca were not any easier on the body. And Spencer, at the end of the day, is also partially responsible because he was a balls out style kind of guy. But that's the part of the risk that the fighters all know that they take on at some point. It's up to the UFC and the boxing commissions in this particular case for them to say, look, you're showing me your original MRI, and look at now your most recent MRI, and look at these dark spots. I don't know. I'm not a doctor. I don't know exactly how to read them, but why do you take an MRI? How do you rule out a fighter because of an MRI, other than that you can see things on them that show signs of some type of problem? You can't tell me his first MRI that he ever took in his career, if he took, say, 4 more throughout his career, that you wouldn't see some type of progression of damage, especially in a guy that fought in that type of style where it was hit and be hit. This isn't 1910 where Ad Walgast they don't have medical resources. But again, the boxing commissions just care. They'll take it. You can get all the tests done properly, and you will not get licensed unless you've put it on a paper with their headers on it. That's what's important to them. It's not the approved form. I've got a freaking signature from an ophthalmologist about my eye test with the ink and all the stuff that they do. And it's on his letterhead, his signature, his stamp, his medical stamp. Everything's there. But you didn't go to the ophthalmological test or whatever test it is with their approved form. You won't get a license. They're paper pushers. They're not doing doctors' work. And the UFC raises their hands and says, well, we don't have anything to do with it. They're independent contractors. So now, to me, sometimes the monopoly allows them to control everything. And at times, something like this could almost cross into criminal negligence of some kind. To send fighters out and say, well, he took another MRI and the boxing commission approved him, knowing that the boxing commission doctors are paper pushing. They don't have a doctor-patient relationship.
Yeah, it all comes back to, like we were talking before, their behavior has always been like this. They've always had contracts that were very restrictive, possibly illegal. Fighters couldn't go out and seek free agency, partially because the UFC destroyed a lot of the other promotions or bought them up, but also because their contract wouldn't allow them to, and still doesn't allow them to. They took the sunset clauses out after Francis Ngannou took advantage of it.
You got the case of Tim Sylvia back in the early days, extreme early days of Zuffa. And that's when, some of the ego and some of this, where Dana now, he thinks he's the only expert and does stuff like that. Because then, too, there was also that, I like this guy, I don't like this guy. And he's a Monty guy, I don't like him. I don't like Tim Sylvia's style. I don't like Tim Sylvia's body. So at some point, Tim was up for a renegotiation. He may have even been in the running for some of the first fights at Brock Lesnar. Tim thinks he would have beat Lesnar. I would have liked to have seen it in the ring. I can't say either way. But what is obviously and a clear fact is that Tim found out what Brock Lesnar's contract was like, and he asked the UFC to have him fight Brock Lesnar. And if he beats Brock, he gets Brock's contract. And the UFC chose to let him go, and he went off to go, I believe, to Japan, or actually maybe to Affliction, where he got some good paydays in outside of the UFC. And then lo and behold, a few years later, Japan's big companies don't exist, Affliction doesn't exist, and they're no longer just releasing fighters, letting them go elsewhere. Stuff like that never happened again. That tightening up of the ship, that doesn't raise bells somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, for sure. There weren't. Although I was going to ask you about this near the end, but I will bring it up now. Ryzen had almost 50,000 people for a show that didn't have any of the Yasakura brothers, didn't have Horiguchi, who are their main stars. What do you think about that?
Again, Ryzen also has a kickboxing tie-in, and they're not a pure MMA event.
Right.
So I think that would almost automatically.
They're even having bare knuckle fights now. So.
And that's okay, but that will almost automatically exclude them as a competitor to the UFC. Again, the challenge for anybody with the UFC is that what they managed to do is now they run absolute weekly shows. There's never a week without UFC fights. And therefore, they can manage a big roster. Ryzen doesn't do that. Ryzen does, from what I can tell, the old formula of maybe a dozen shows a year or whatever that is. Maybe it's a little more active. I'm not a big follower of Ryzen.
Yeah,
But
they have
so now
different
they do a bare
levels. They
knuckle
have
fight.
like a Ryzen Landmark, regular Ryzen. So they do have, but they have some smaller shows. Yeah.
Yeah, again, how is that an option for a guy like an Ngannou? There may be like one or two fighters who could go over to Ryzen and maybe get a good deal, or a handful of fighters who could go over there and get a good deal and continue their MMA career. But they would see their, you know, their Instagram ticks and stuff like that, if they're not fighting in the United States and in the UFC, would instantly go down. There's whatever social media presence, especially there are guys that have built up a social media presence. So on top of everything else, they get a little check from Instagram every month. Ryzen to me is not a competitor. The problem is also that there was a wave of schools and events in Japan during the heyday of the sport there that doesn't seem to be there anymore. Aside from, a 115-pound kickboxer that, kind of got the crossover star that you like so much that, I really don't care much about. The last real tried and true MMA star I remember being developed and coming up, it was a homegrown guy that became a superstar there, is now on the verge of retirement because of old age. And that would be Shinya Aoki. Aoki's a guy that they followed. I believe he started out in Shudo, that they followed him. He left Shudo for a little while to go to the police academy, and there was also kinds of publicity there. And he came back, and he's had a 50, 60 fight career. He's an edgy guy. He broke Keith Wisniewski's arm with a mean maneuver. And those
Yeah,
are the
I was
kind of
at the
guys.
fight. I
You
was
were
at
at
that
that
fight.
one?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
cool. And that was early in his career. Since then, he's beaten guys and given them the finger, American style, Conor McGregor style. you know. But there is no young Aokis coming up that I can see. If Ryzen has one, I haven't seen him on the MMA ends. They don't have a homegrown star anymore. Sakuraba, was that guy for a long time, and they never replaced him. And without having that type of level of athlete in Japan, you won't get a Japanese show that can compare.
One thing you may have missed is they ran a promo for Sakuraba's son, who's going to be making his debut in Ryzen soon.
I hope he's better than LeBron's son.
Yeah, that could be a jolt for them, And if this trial goes sideways for the UFC, we could maybe see a whole lot of free agency near the end of the year, beginning of next year.
That is one of the end game results that would be a game changer if it gets. If the result of the lawsuit is that every contract the UFC has is declared null and void. And, technically that could happen with the clauses that they put in there. If the judge wants to come down heavy-handed enough and the jury concludes that they are guilty of some of this behavior, that could be one of the end results. And yes, that would make a big difference. But again, with Sakuraba's son, it's interesting. But like I said, with Sakuraba, you're talking about a guy that was probably the number one guy in the world for a little bit. And those are big shoes to fill, and it's a lot of pressure to put on the kid. Unless the kid's also a phenom and has already shown signs of it, then you may be looking at just, another flash in the pan kind of thing, or something that is not ready to carry the weight of the Japanese market on his shoulder for 10 years like Sakuraba did.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think there's a lot we could chew on with some of these newer things if you had a chance to watch it. It's
I
been
plead,
interesting.
yeah, I plead that I'm glad you're watching it. That's kind of, one of the things I count you on is to keep me informed of some of these types of interesting developments. I have to admit, after, 25 years in the business or more here, that I'm impressed that, that you're still impressed by some of these things, because they start to not get impressive to me. And, I'd like to see something big and sustained go. I remember when one came out, I said it on one of my earlier podcasts. I said, when one started, I said, let's see them do 20 shows. Well, they have. And, for that, my hat's off to them. I was sort of wrong for being sarcastic. They did have that staying power. But, you know, we need another one of those. We need another two of those.
Yeah, something Zach said that was interesting, though. On a day when there was a UFC pay-per-view, there was another show going on that did like twice as many people. And that was Super Ryzen 3.
Well, let me ask you a question. Was the Ryzen show shown in Brazil? Was the Ryzen show shown in London?
No, but now something that Pride didn't have, that Ryzen does have now, is pay-per-view. Japan is now kind of doing the pay-per-view thing, and they've been getting some big numbers apparently.
Yeah, they pay-per-view numbers in a country like Japan could be bigger than pay-per-view numbers in the States. But you'd also have to look at pricing and things like that, because, like, for example, pay-per-view boxing numbers in England, the Brits pay a lot less than the Americans for their pay-per-view. So it's a hard balance to look at, but Ryzen has some bits and pieces that get on the global radar. Every single UFC is on the global radar.
Plus, I think the media purposely doesn't cover, much like this lawsuit. There hasn't been a lot of coverage by the mainstream MMA media.
Because you've got a bully like Dana, and everybody who's in the circle of media that has access to the shows and things is going to ask the question, consciously or subconsciously, what does Dana think? What is Dana going to think if I do that? I could get banned. And that's as simple as that. And Dana's opinion, we've seen it, is to have poo-pooed this lawsuit from the very beginning. Make it seem as unimportant as possible. And the media has, like they usually do with them, gone right along with that and not giving it the coverage that it should.
Yeah, there's very few people. I mean, and that's another thing with the trial. It might be hard for somebody to go there every day of the trial and, put out what's happening. Josh Gross has been at some of these things, but there's been almost very little to speak of.
If you had a company like Full Contact Fighter still there that was not run by the UFC's shills, they might publish, hey, here's the trial thing every week, and you might be able to maintain a journalistic job of covering it. But now, you can write an article. Sherdog never mentions it. MMA Junkie rarely mentions it, if ever. You have to go to smaller sites and more blogging or message boards and things to really dig into, find out some of the other information. And as we pointed out in this podcast, sometimes the information just isn't there. Because Josh can only go every once in a while. Some guys can only go every once in a while. That's a result of the UFC's monopoly operating over the last 20 years.
One thing I'm curious about now that we've been talking, and I don't know, I'm not a lawyer or any of this stuff, and I wish I could ask a lawyer this. When the judge comes out, when he does put his statement out or whatever, his findings of why he turned down I wonder if he has to walk a fine line between saying they're guilty, or if he'll say, look, they did this, this, and this, and the settlement resulted in none of this being changed. Because in a way, you're saying they're guilty by doing this, this, and this. you know.
No, I think, and again, I'm not a lawyer either, but I think that he has to have the jury decide the guilt. So I think that the statement could very well should, in my opinion, be like, there are signs that need to be reviewed. I suspect that this type of behavior has been happening. There are strong indicators that the UFC has been operating in this way that bear further exploration. I think that's the way it will be handled, because if he comes out and says guilty, they're guilty of this, this, and this, and therefore there should be a trial. I don't think he can say any of
No,
that.
I don't think he'd say that, but when I'm saying he's giving us points as to why he rejected it.
Yeah,
I wonder how careful he has to be with that.
There's clear signs of a consistent pattern of behavior heading towards a monopoly. I think we've gone over a consistent pattern of behavior in this podcast, where from the very beginning to the end, they've shown the tendency of find an income stream and start to absorb it so that nobody else makes money but us.
Yeah, and also, making the newer contracts, there's verbiage in there that you won't participate in a class action lawsuit. And this is one of the things I was talking about post. I think they did that before the settlement came out, but their behavior pre and post settlement. Also, they got rid of this guy Muhammad Makayev. I don't know if you had saw much about that. Although, maybe he got in a fight with his opponent in the hotel and stuff. There were some problems there. But he's an undefeated flyweight, good fighter, and they let him go. But their behavior, out front bullish behavior like Dana White does, they haven't changed that one iota. If anything, they're doing it more, and I don't think they're helping their cause by doing that stuff, because the judge is probably seeing that.
Yeah, at this point, really, it reminds me of the Star Wars scene in the first movie where they see the hologram of R2-D2 and Princess Leia, and she says, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope." The judge is really our only hope, because the reason that Dana and this company continues to behave that way is they've done so with impunity for so many years now. Nobody's called them on it. Anybody who's called them on it has fallen by the wayside, and they've crushed. So why would you change?
And that's just like collateral monopoly damage, with the MMA media. These people aren't employed by the UFC, but they can't really report the way they want to because they're afraid of, this is like collateral monopoly damage,
Yeah, more signs. It's a monopoly implies kind of a total control, where if something pops up that's a threat to your money or to your reputation, you address it. And in Dana's case, he addresses it aggressively to the end, and that means to your end. And again, like I said, you're talking about a competitor like a Kobe Bryant or Michael Jordan. I know those are weird comparisons, but Dana's a guy who won't sleep. He'll relentlessly pursue, and he does it at a level where if you want to go head on with him, he's going to have more energy. He has put more personal, like every vendetta, every one of those types of situations he does, he aggressively, he does it with a confidence where he doesn't think he's wrong. But I think that's what one of the questions I asked here at the very beginning of this podcast is, because nobody takes him on doesn't mean he's right.
I want to put you on the spot here because I know I asked you this before. Now that, because I know kind of your take before was if the settlement gets turned down, that you think UFC will pull it and they'll go to trial. Do you still believe that?
I'm not sure. Here's the thing is I think at some point the UFC guys are going to have to, go into a bathroom somewhere, turn on the radio real loud so they can't be recorded and actually really talk about this thing. And the idea of the trial, one of the things that comes up when you talk about the actual trial and the settlement, and I think the judge has been clear about this, mentioning it recently, is that let's say the thing, they settle for $335 million. Let's say the settlement at the judge's decisions after a trial goes up to $2 billion, maybe 6 times more money than they have now. I believe the law says that number could be tripled. So there is a risk of making the money be painful to them. That's the thing, is $335 million doesn't hurt the UFC at all. They already even went out in their statements and told everybody how they book kept this thing. It's on the books for next month or for next year. Law, they already outlined that somewhere in this recent couple of months. So they run the risk of it being painful, and they run the risk of it being in the hands of 12 people who you don't know what you're going to get. I do think that they don't want to change their business practices. So if that's the hanging point, they may decide to go to trial and fight it out there. They can also shrink things out longer that way. But I think that the next step is for them to come back with a bigger offer for a settlement and see if that appeases the judge in some way. The judge may very well have heard, even behind the scenes, from some of the plaintiffs and saying, look, man, $5,000 is a joke. You haven't seen any fighter say that in public, but has the judge gotten his ear to the ground enough to know that there are a lot of disappointed fighters in the money that they were going to get or were scheduled to get? So what happens if that wave changes? Like I said, if you took this settlement from $335 million to $3.3 billion, every single fighter being offered $5,000 would get $50,000. And there's a big difference between 5 and 50.
Let me ask you this, like you're saying, the money could get tripled. Maybe going to trial, if they have to give up like 5-6 billion or whatever the number might be, that's the kind of money that maybe could put them out of business, perhaps.
Oh, they'll
is
cry
it not?
poverty. Yeah, I don't know if they'll go out of business. They're worth a lot more than that, according to the estimates. But I think that they will strenuously use every trick in the book to, say, okay, well, the 335, we were going to write a check. This thing we're going to have to string out, and the fighters will get payments for the next 10 years. But little tricks like that could help. It's like they set up the payment. So if you were due 50,000, you were due 5,000 in the first lawsuit, and you were due $50,000 now because of a $3 billion settlement. Most of those fighters would probably be okay with getting a $10,000 check every 6 months for the next couple of years, or whatever time period is appropriate there. I mean, if it was getting a $10,000 check or a $5,000 check every 2 months for the next little bit of time, I'm sure they would all be okay with it. I can't say that. I can't say I'd be sure that, but it seems a lot more palatable than just a one-time $5,000 check.
But I think for the judge, the money's not going to be enough. There has to be more concessions with the contracts. If there's not, I don't think he'll prove anything. Yeah,
we'll see. We'll see. When the money goes up, and it all comes down to what's the impetus here? What is the judge hearing from the plaintiffs directly, not through the lawyers, but has he, has some of the fighters gotten in his ear and said, this is bullshit? Look at it a little more. And then what happens if the money goes up by 10 times and that buzz from the fighters goes away? And he doesn't have that, then the judge may not be as motivated to, like you said, stick his neck out.
Right. So I don't think he's sticking his neck out. I think what I mean is,
I think he's doing his job.
this
But
trial came about because the UFC is a monopoly, because they do things contractually they're probably illegal. All these other things we've talked about. If they just throw money at it and don't change anything, this trial didn't accomplish squat. There's still a monopoly. Their contracts are still illegal. They're still able to operate doing all the things that got us to this point.
John Fitch is one of the more vocal fighters about the monopoly and the way that the UFC controls things and stuff. And so John's got a pretty extensive UFC career as well. So let's say John was due $100,000 in this original settlement, or say $300,000. If they move the settlement up 10 times, then that becomes $3 million. And the difference from $300,000 to $3 million maybe is enough for John Fitch to shut up and never complain again about the UFC. Or actually go back to the judge and go, this makes it all right.
Sure, but then the fighters that are still in the UFC, they're still going to be getting screwed in the same fashion as what brought this trial to begin with. And if I'm the judge, that's on me. You have to feel some pressure there. If I was the judge, if I just let them throw some money at this and they don't do anything to address the problem, that's my fault. And now people can come at me and say, I just let them get out of this scot-free.
Yeah. So, how will the judge react if the UFC, as a consequence of paying the settlement, they dish out a lot more money, and then they go back to every single fighter on their roster and triple the money on their contracts, but say the rest of the contract stays the same? In other words, they would be giving up more of their revenue and giving it to the fighters, and you'd have a lot less complaining fighters, and it would look a lot less. And again, they can point like no other to, like a sports company. It's the fighter contracts have gone in the last little bit of time to them getting probably about 500% more than they did back in the old days as they walk in the door. Now you triple that, and they're legitimately getting raises, but changing no other business policy. I don't know how the judge reacts to that. You're on mute.
Yeah, I think it'll be telling in his statement, because I think there'll be some of that, that I think he'll use some wording to indicate without going overboard. He'll say, look, not only was the payout small, but nothing changed here. I think that's what it's, how he says it, I don't know, but that's what he's going to say.
If the UFC came out and made a change to the pay scale again that they could handle and afford, but left everything else the same, would that be enough to influence the judge? In other words, at the end of the day, this is about revenue sharing. And they would be giving up some of their revenue. Some of Dana's, $500 billion wouldn't be getting added to as fast or whatever, Yeah, it's gonna get interesting. The judges made this a very interesting drama, and for the people that were out there saying nothing's gonna come of it or whatever, though it looked that way when the settlement was dealt with, was put in public and it seemed to be accepted and stuff like that. The judges, kind of said nay, and so we're still watching, we're still looking. I think it is hard to predict because, again, the one overwhelming umbrella over this is that the UFC usually fights until they get their way. No, not usually, every time. So, if this is the time that they're finally going to take a loss, it's going to be very interesting to watch. But I'm not ready to say that they're ready to lose just yet. I think we're in for a fight. That's the other part of I think Josh had mentioned. You mentioned to me that Josh, because it is true, I have not listened to the Josh podcast yet. Though I'm very eager to, because
The
I
one with
definitely
Zach. I mean,
respect
Zach.
Zach.
Yeah.
Sorry, Zach's. See, I mixed him up with Josh Gross. So,
Yeah.
but um, but I'm very eager to see what Zach says. But one of the things there was that the UFC might want to go to trial on this. And I'm not sold on yet. But I do think that once you decide to go to trial, they can get into another situation where the trial won't come to fruition, no matter what the judge wants, for several more years, and they can just keep stringing it out.
No, apparently it would be in October if they go to trial.
Yeah, but once the trial, yeah, and what you think, it's done in 15 days? No, I think within the trial there are methods to
Right. It'll
extend,
take a while, and they could
and then
appeal. Yeah.
and then with appeals and stuff, that would be the end game of that, is that they would string out, and then they would get another few more years of this, of doing what they do, and then just see what the landscape is like.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's I was very disappointed when the settlement happened, and now it's gotten interesting again.
Yeah. So maybe tell people what you got going on at the MMA Collector now.
Well, I think tomorrow morning, maybe at the same time as this podcast goes out, we're going to be doing. We've published our interview with Dean Thomas, which you helped me out with. Dean, legend. Dean, a guy who's kind of a commentator with ESPN that is still in the sport. He gave a really great interview, a heartfelt interview. The memories and going down memory lane. You could tell he enjoyed the look back. And I think it was us kind of clicking on high cylinders. It was good. I'd booked him a few times and we knew each other. It always kind of makes me feel good when guys like that will still take my phone call and come on and do the interview. We told him it'd be an hour. It wound up lasting about 2 hours. I didn't hear him complain or try to bail out of the interview or anything like that. I think he legitimately had fun, and the fans are in for a treat there.
Yeah, it's great. It was great stuff, and both of us have known him a long time, and yeah, he got to cover a lot of different ground on his career and what he's doing now, how he got there. So, yeah, very interesting. And maybe talk a little bit about the dog rescue as well. And he's gonna bring one up here, I think. Oh yeah, he's got. Oh yeah, that's a good one right there. I like those kind of. Yeah, I like those kind.
Yeah, this is a good dog. He's a grumpy little guy if you try to get at his food and stuff, but he's one of the guys that I'm starting to watch here at the house right now. I'm actually moving to a little bit bigger place, so I
cool.
may be caring for a couple more dogs than I was before on a personal level. This is Rocky. It's Rocky for everybody. So yeah, this guy was definitely a street rescue, covered in fleas, probably 10 kilos, 8 kilos underweight. He's a medium dog. He's not a huge dog, but now he's doing well. That's kind of the buzz about it, just to see him be happy and be happy. He's happy when he sees me, and that's for sure, which I can't say most humans are. So it gives me a good feeling too. Woo, Rocky, you're on television now.
And for everybody, we have a notes in the show notes where you can contribute to the dog rescue and stuff. And yeah, we appreciate your support. And as always, checking out these episodes. We have memberships, 99-cent memberships. If you guys want to check that out. And we always appreciate your support and be on the lookout for more episodes. Take care.
I'm gonna give you a shout out, Todd, because like a lot of people might not know how long you've been in the game for. I mean, Todd, you've been in the game since day one, and not a lot of people might not know it. It's to me, when I see all these guys in the game, I always, I just go, man, you don't know what the game is about because you ain't even been in it. When I see guys like you still involved, and like these new jacks come in, like they may not give you your respect, and they need to give you your respect because you've been in the game just as long as anybody. You know what I'm saying? So, if y'all out there, y'all better recognize Todd been in the game since day one.